Thank you very much for coming. My name is Mike Stewart. I'm from a company called ESP Thinking. And this talk is Educational Enigmas. How do we solve the teaching workload crisis? Or also known as putting the fun into fundamental thinking strategies. So every once in a while, a revolutionary product comes along and changes everything. In this case, it's this. Now, you may laugh, but at this point in time, this little fella here is reading all of your minds. And when I click this button, it's going to produce up on the board what everyone is thinking. So, bit harsh, obviously, but that's kind of what you'd expect if you're looking at people's unvarnished thought processes. So, great orators throughout the ages have essentially tried to motivate people by making them feel a part of something, an idea bigger than everyone else. So it's a club. So these are motivational speeches. This isn't one of those. This talk is actually designed on purpose to make you feel uncomfortable. Now, generally speaking, that's kind of the remit of these kinds of people, because a really good comedy act will bring you into an awkward situation and then make you laugh by basically saying things out loud that you would never actually consider saying yourself. Unfortunately, this isn't one of those either, as you'll doubtless work out over the course of the next 15 minutes. Oh, right, okay, yep, sorry, just making adjustments. Better? Doesn't actually do anything, just makes me feel better. So, right. I am a fundamentalist. Now, actually, I'm a physical biochemist by training. Now, that means that I'm essentially kind of the jack of all trades of the scientific world. The fundamentalist part is in physics, because physicists have one main purpose: to try and understand how things work. Right? So, if you're talking about a complex system, then understanding the fundamental parts of it in more detail, helping to make reasonable decisions. So, being a fundamentalist is an important part of this. What it's not, though, just for your future information, it's not something you want to be putting on your Facebook page, because those watch lists are no joke, and it's only really paranoia if they're not actually out to get you. Just bear in mind. So, with complex systems, there are lots and lots of variables. And part of the reason that I say this now is because you will always hear lots of different elements in terms of evidence within education. And that's all fine, but you do need to bear in mind that there are, with all of these variables, it can be very, very difficult to make particular judgments. So what we're going to do is we're going to try and create a working model of some of the fundamental thought processes behind the way that we all interact. And as a function of that, we can then go on to apply it, because it's fundamental, we can apply it in lots of different ways. So this is where we're going to start, the brain. Okay? One of the most complicated structures in the entire universe, and we're going to explain it using just 3 sections. So it's not the most comprehensive description you'll ever find. But we have 3 basic regions. The brainstem, also known as the reptilian complex, is all of your survival mechanisms: body rhythms, fight, flight, lust, or as it's also known, if you're a teenager, an average Friday night. Then you've got the limbic system, which is processing all of the inputs that it's actually feeling at any one time. Then you've got the cortex, the higher thinking senses, which are attempting to process all of that information and attach meaning to it. So, here's our first key point that we need to bear in mind, okay? The brainstem can shut down the cortex in times of stress. That means you don't think clearly when the red mists come down. It's something that we know intuitively, but it's something that we need to bear in mind whenever we're talking about interacting with people, especially when we're trying to persuade them of something. Second part of the brain, in terms of messages. So we've got 2 sets of chemicals involved in messaging within the brain: hormones which are slower and wider ranging, and then we've got neurotransmitters, which are faster and on very, very short range. In effect, very, very roughly speaking, messaging, emotions, okay? So our second key point, we all feel the same things. We have the same sets of hormones. Okay, so that's one thing we all have in common. Where we differ is in the way that our brains interpret those messages. Okay, and that's a very important message that will just keep coming back throughout our discussion. So our third part of our whistle-stop tour of psychology and education, evolutionary psychology. Okay, so this, because we're talking about fundamentals, what we're actually looking to do is to look throughout the animal kingdom and look for patterns of behaviour. Because the more frequently you see a particular behaviour, the more fundamental it's going to be. So, for example, we feel more secure when we're in a group. Okay? So, and actually, if you do there's a rough correlation throughout the animal kingdom between cortex size and social group numbers. Okay? Now, sadly, that doesn't mean if you've got 3,000 friends on your Facebook page that actually you're smarter than the rest of us. What it does mean is that there is a pleasure response associated with that. And some of the issues around social media are around the fact that actually those hits of that pleasure response are actually addictive in the longer term. So, there are other signals that are relevant throughout the animal kingdom as well. So, for example, a study in voles that actually looked at a particular hormone, oxytocin, also known as the love hormone, but they showed that there was, and they could match the empathetic responses between voles, and those responses were stronger when the voles were more closely related. The less closely related they were, the less those empathetic responses were, the less the oxytocin. Yes, ladies and gentlemen, it turns out that voles can be racist. Because what you're actually talking about is a biochemical mechanism by which those pleasure and pain responses are used on an instinctive level. That's not what I'm doing. There is a very big difference between, as I said, the way that we feel some of those instinctive reactions and the way that we process them and the way that we actually act. Some of the issues that we're actually talking about are how we actually guide our actions by understanding some of those instinctive reactions. So, our evolutionary instincts drive us via pleasure and pain responses, right? We feel, as individuals, we get a pleasure response by affirmation, by feeling one of us. We feel a correspondingly pain response when we feel or interpret that we're on our own. So all of these instinctive reactions are part of understanding why and how we actually act in the way that we do. So, if all of this sounds familiar, that you can use fear and messages and groups together by way of persuasive arguments, that's politics, okay? As a matter of fact, if you take it to the nth degree, you've got populism. Plain, simple messages that create a particular pain or pleasure response. That means that complexity and politics are not the best of bedfellows, okay? That's not an inherent fault. None of this, we don't do fault in this particular talk. It's not what we're about. But it's a function of the fact that in order to get people out to vote in big numbers, you need a simple message that people can associate with, okay? You need that emotional attachment. So when people use messages that induce that fear response or induce that pleasure response, that's what they're playing to, but it doesn't lend itself to dealing with complex issues. And it doesn't take an historian to work out recent issues that have actually brought that type of thing to the fore. So, In education, we are constantly surrounded by issues that have polarized opinions. It's a very emotive and therefore very polarized environment. So if a conversation can be described as two people waiting to interrupt each other, then working in education can be described as a series of interactions waiting for a hand grenade to go off. There's a tension in there because of the extremes of the opinion, which mean that even if you've got your reasons for being on one side of the argument, you can end up getting hammered on the other side. So Ofsted are a function of that, and again, none of this is to do with blame, it's not an accusation, it's not anything else, it's a function of how things work. So Ofsted will go into a school and they've spent a long time preparing policies in terms of the reasons why they go about doing things, and it's like playing Snap with someone that's got a completely different deck team. So, 2 of clubs, it's all right, got that one. 6 of hearts, it's all right, we're still safe, we're doing okay. 37 of pentagons, it's like, oh, this is going to end badly. So these are the types of things we face. So now we're on to these people, teachers. As I said, constantly surrounded by these particular issues that can be explosive and polarized on either end. Now, in order to attempt to apply what we've been talking about to these issues throughout teaching, what we need to do is we need to have an end game in mind. So what is it that we're actually trying to create as an education system, okay? And as I say, from a fundamentalist point of view, suggest this as an answer. We are looking to create self-motivated, independent learners. If we give those people those skill sets, then then the rest of things start falling into place that much easier. That's not easy though, for the simple fact that there are narratives that have been created based on emotional environments, based on instinctive responses, and if you try and challenge those in too strong a way, all you end up doing is evoking that us and them response. Okay, so we need to be smarter in terms of what we're doing. In effect, when you're running a classroom, you are, in essence, playing 30 sets of three-dimensional chess. You're looking to evoke the right responses to lead people through their emotional networks and everything else without disturbing that too much and get them to an end position. In effect, what we've got now, because of time constraints and toolkits and everything else, we're playing an educational version of whack-a-mole. It's can we respond quickly enough to what's going on across the room, and that's, in effect, what we're left with. So, we're now going to use this fellow again, and what I'd like you to do is I'd like you to think about one of those instinctive situations that are causing these types of issues, and let's see what we got. So, retention, behaviour, workloads have come up a fair bit, not really surprising, that's why you're sat. But resilience, assessment, development, support, skills, all of these issues have polarised opinions on either side. So if we take a few of those and we'll try and apply the mechanisms that we're talking about to how these things work. Oh, by the way, these are the educational enigmas, okay? These are the puzzles that we're all facing within the education system to try and to create different outcomes. And it's important to bear in mind two things when we're talking about these things. Firstly, the idea of righteous indignation needs to be banned. Now, I do realise the irony in trying to suggest that righteous indignation needs to be banned by getting righteously indignant about it. But you're going to need to bear with me on that. Right? We need to put ourselves into both camps, regardless of how difficult we find the process, because we are undergoing those same instinctive reactions as well. If you don't end up feeling uncomfortable by exploring all of the ideas around a subject, I hate to break this to you, but you're just staying in your comfort zone. You need to challenge all of these ideas if we're going to move beyond that and find mechanisms that can actually help. So, behaviour. Start off with a big one. Probably the subject that's most likely to want any particular teacher adopting the fetal position under the desk. So, the two extremes of that, or one particular plane of that anyway, is the idea of discipline, keeping a class quiet, making them follow the rules and everything else, versus the other extreme of creating working relationships. On its very extreme, it's being every student's best friend, but bear with me. So the ideas in terms of discipline, when we look at it in terms of our fundamental viewpoints, are that we are trying to induce a pleasure-pain response to success or failure. Nothing wrong with that methodology, in theory. There are some really important caveats. So you can argue, well, it didn't do me any harm. You could jump off a cliff a couple of times and survive. That's not necessarily the reason for making a habit of it. It works in the army. It does. It certainly does. It's a disciplined unit. But what people need to remember is that people who are in the army, they fight for the people that are next to them. They are, by definition, a club. You are one of them when you are a part of it. And so they are going to be moving more likely with one voice. They have that instinct that's been nailed down with that narrative, that this is how we do things. So unless you're actually managing to do that, and you can do that within a classroom, you can do that within a school, if you can make them feel part of something, then you will start to get them wanting to follow you in terms of what you're trying to do. In terms of working relationships, as I've already said, the idea of making creating a response by which you're getting someone to buy into what you're doing actually involves you, firstly, understanding that you have the same sets of feelings, understanding where their narratives actually come from, and then persuading them that your narrative can not only get them better outcomes, but doesn't tear away at everything that they think that they know already. If you're just being everyone's friend, and their narratives are stronger, guess what? They're going to roll over you all day, every day. Because the narratives are different to yours. So unless you're actually managing to change those narratives, you're going to be struggling. So in terms of a behaviour management system, because just in terms of, I don't know, throwing some ideas out there, you're looking for something that takes away the conflict from the teacher, so the system takes care of things, but the teacher's able to record everything, so there isn't the option to actually take advantage. And yes, we have created a system that does exactly that. A system whereby you can just record positive and negative interactions using a flick on the screen. That's secondary to what we're trying to do here. We're trying to speak wider. So what's our next one? Support. On the one extreme, you've got independence and resilience. On the other extreme, you've got anxiety and disengagement. If you don't give enough support, if I was to say to someone, you're going to learn to swim today, and push them into a lake, there's a cruelty in that. It's cruel because they might not swim. They might sink. That's why they call it sink or swim. However, if you're constantly supporting them in the water, there's a cruelty in that as well. There's a cruelty in that because it makes you feel better that, look, they're swimming. They haven't had to struggle. Unless you give people the chance to actually learn themselves, then you're really struggling with with this particular balance. So what you're looking for is a mechanism to give the right level of support at any one time with a view to them making progress, and they're going to have to fail sometimes. So the idea that a number is going to cause offence, yes, I can see where the understanding behind that is, but unless you can build the resilience in to be able to deal with issues along those lines, sorry, you're staying in your comfort zone. And if you're starting to feel uncomfortable around about now, this is what I was talking about. We need to feel uncomfortable in these situations. We need to test ourselves in terms of our viewpoints to end up in a way that we're actually not just doing things that we find easy. Inclusion. This is probably one of the toughest ones because it's one of the most emotive. Quiet classroom is good for the many. If you've got someone that's destroying a classroom because of their behaviour, it is absolutely human nature to want them out of that space so you can help everyone else, without question. However, each individual that we end up passing through the system and just ending up excluding them because we can't find any other way, we have failed. There's no question about that. We have failed them. We haven't managed to engage them. We haven't managed to get them to believe in what we're trying to do for them. We've lost the struggle in terms of the narratives. So in terms of that process, we need to build those relationships. We need systems that allow, that free teachers up to engage with more students. We need systems to be able to assign work to people that makes them feel included. Because that's what inclusion actually means. It's not just about the idea of teaching in a particular way, it's making someone feel a part of something. And when we do that, they will start to buy in, we will start to have a more positive effect. There are ways of doing that without having to design from scratch every individual activity. Because I can imagine if this guy was switched on at the moment, he'd be thinking just about how much work that actually feels like. The mechanism to be able to do that is collaboration. We should not be reinventing every lesson for every subject. I was a physics teacher and I'm fairly sure the laws of physics haven't changed that often. But the ability to have a modularized format by which you can plug activities in and out very, very quickly that are based on a skills focus, then we start to have a system where we can plan on a detailed mechanism without being up until 2 o'clock every morning. And yes, that is another part of this. So assessment, in terms of workload, we end up in like a dirty little secret. There are lots of children in our classes because of the workload that we don't actually know. There are lots of reports that we end up writing where we end up putting blanket statements in and changing the odd word here and there. And again, none of that is about blame. It's a function of the situations we find ourselves in. However, gathering data helps us make better decisions in terms of who we can help. If we don't give people the resilience to be able to understand what those numbers mean, then again, we're staying in our comfort zone. First thing that we should be saying to, and I'm sorry, this was just my approach. First thing that you say to a group when they first come into a room, never ever worry about a test score. Now you will see at the end of that sentence, certain students, probably at the back, start putting their feet up on the desk. It's like, no, you misunderstand. We're not saying don't put the effort in. We are saying try your best, try to improve, And if the test scores aren't there after that point, that's my fault, that's not yours. So in large parts, teacher workloads is actually about giving lots of the responsibility back to the student. But that doesn't mean that there aren't certain aspects that we need to take responsibility for ourselves. So when it comes down to workloads, a little bit of a summary in terms of what we're trying to do. We have to try and decide which jobs are actually the teacher needs to do. So marking is not a job you need to do. You need to give feedback. So feedback can be in the form of a score out of 5 that's linked to a criteria. Feedback can be in the form of model answers, as opposed to writing the answers out 55 times. So we need to be smarter in those particular terms. We need to pass more responsibility back to the student, and as we've already discussed, that is not a bad thing. If we're supporting students through the process so much that they don't know what the process is there for in terms of what their development needs, where their targets are, then again, we're in our comfort zone, we're happy. The students are not getting what they need from the whole process. Next, what jobs can be streamlined? School leaders, in terms of these policies, need to be in a position where they are taking some of the responsibility in terms of making the decisions. This is my one political statement out of all of this, because that's, again, this isn't about that. If we just create a set of very high targets and then say, well, we're giving you the freedom for how you can actually get there. We know it's an impossible target, but we will skip over that bit. And then we're surprised by the fact that they actually don't manage to get there. Guess what? It's it. We're in our comfort zone. We just passed off that responsibility. No, can't do that. If we can justify the mechanisms by which we make our decisions, then, we've made that statement. There's our policy, and we take away a lot of the stress that surrounds teachers that don't know where they're supposed to fit in. Doesn't mean you can't give them freedom. Doesn't mean you can't. You're not taking away, you're not being dictatorial. It's about creating policies that say, this is what we can do, this is how we can do it, and supporting them in terms of how they actually get there. Finally, in terms of fundamentally where we actually look for teachers to be, if we can get to the stage where we are more of a guide in the process, doesn't mean you can't do your talk and talk. We've been passing along information in the form of stories for thousands of years. It didn't suddenly become a bad thing because someone said, oh, by the way, you're talking too much in a lesson. You can tell stories, you can build relationships, you can do all of that. But as a whole, your role in the teaching profession is to be a guide, because that is all part of this, giving them the responsibility for what they do and how they do it. So, on that note, thank you very much, and are there any questions? No? Okay, thank you very much.